in 55 when I started with the Tennessee Two. Our first public concert was in a church.
There are deaths that shake the world quietly, and the passing of Johnny Cash on September 12, 2003, was exactly that kind of tremor. Radio stations paused their regular programming to let his voice fill the airwaves one more time. Strangers placed handwritten notes and bouquets outside museums bearing his name. Music journalists reached for their most reverent vocabulary. Fellow artists spoke in hushed, almost disbelieving tones about the void he had left behind. To the outside world, the story seemed to write itself. A towering figure of American music had passed on, and naturally, his music, his money, and his name would flow forward to the family that had stood beside him for decades. That assumption was tidy, respectful, and completely wrong. While tributes poured in from every corner of the globe, a far quieter process was already underway. Estate lawyers were reviewing documents prepared years in advance. Family members, still raw with grief, were beginning to hear phrases like intellectual property allocation and trust disbursement for the first time. What emerged from that process stunned many of them and left fans questioning everything they thought they understood about the Cash family. Johnny Cash was not handed anything. Born in 1932 in Kingsland, Arkansas, his parents were part of a government resettlement program that placed struggling farming families on plots in Dyess, Arkansas. From childhood onward, he picked cotton, attended a small church where gospel music lived in the walls, and listened to a radio that pulled distant sounds through the static. After high school, he enlisted in the Air Force and was posted to Germany, sharpening his guitar skills during his off hours. When he returned to Memphis in the early 1950s, the city was alive with musical experimentation. In 1954, he walked through the doors of Sun Records, and everything changed. A deep, unhurried voice, emotional honesty that felt almost confrontational. He became a rising national presence almost overnight. The true financial shift came in 1958 when Cash signed with Columbia Records. Albums moved through major distribution pipelines, and because he wrote much of his own material, he held songwriting rights, a detail that would prove enormously significant for decades to come. The launch of his own television program on ABC in 1969 amplified everything. Record sales, brand recognition, and licensing potential all climbed simultaneously. By the early 1970s, he was no longer just a musician. He had become an entertainment enterprise. The 1980s brought turbulence, addiction, health setbacks, and shifting commercial tastes slowed his momentum. But Cash refused to become a nostalgia act. In the 1990s, producer Rick Rubin proposed stripping everything back to just the voice, an acoustic guitar, and the truth. The result was American Recordings, an album that made critics and listeners sit straight up. His cover of Hurt, accompanied by a video that felt like a man reckoning with his own mortality, became one of the most discussed pieces of music in years. By the early 2000s, industry observers estimated the total estate somewhere between several tens of millions and close to $100 million, encompassing music rights, real estate, personal assets, and intellectual property built across nearly 5 decades. Before June Carter, there was Vivian Liberto, whom Cash met in 1951 while stationed at Lackland Air Force Base. Their courtship was conducted almost entirely through letters while he was deployed abroad, and they married in 1954 just as his recording career was beginning. Vivian was a private person, deeply rooted in her faith and family. As Cash's fame exploded and his struggles with substances intensified, she remained home in California raising their 4 daughters, Roseanne, Kathy, Cindy, and Tara, while the man she had married drifted further from the person he had been when they met. June Carter entered his life as someone who already understood the industry from the inside, a member of the Carter family dynasty, who had navigated 2 previous marriages of her own. Where Vivian had wanted stability and privacy, June offered something different, a partner who could operate in his world, manage his chaos, and match him creatively on stage. When they married in 1968, June stepped into a role that blended spouse, collaborator, and gatekeeper. Together they had 1 son, John Carter Cash, born in 1970, the only child they shared, a fact that would carry enormous legal and emotional weight decades later. The family the world saw projected warmth and unity. But behind that image was a household shaped by competing histories, loyalties, and memories that ran far deeper than any televised performance could reveal. Cash passed away 4 months after June, who had died in May 2003. That proximity in time was not just emotionally devastating, it was legally consequential. His 4 daughters from his marriage to Vivian were each left individual cash settlements, reportedly around $1 million apiece. That figure sounds significant until you hold it against what the other portion of the estate was worth, and more importantly, what it would continue to generate. The core commercial infrastructure, the rights to Cash's name and likeness, his publishing interests, and control over his archival recordings, was not divided among the 5 children. It was consolidated and directed primarily toward John Carter Cash, named as the principal executor and primary heir to the business side of the estate. A legal instrument known as a revocable trust ensured the transfer happened privately, without the public disclosure that accompanies probate proceedings. No laws were broken. No documents were concealed. Estate attorneys confirmed the outcome reflected exactly what Cash and June had intended. But for the daughters, and for many fans who had absorbed decades of imagery depicting the Cash family as a unified whole, the reality that emerged was jarring. As years passed and the estate's ongoing revenues grew, the contrast between the daughters' fixed inheritance and the compounding income flowing through the business side became increasingly difficult to ignore. In 2007, the 4 daughters filed a federal lawsuit targeting what they considered the most symbolic asset in the entire catalog, Ring of Fire. As one of the most recognizable songs in American music history, its royalty stream represented a perpetual income source, and the daughters argued that as their father's biological heirs, they were legally entitled to a share of the copyright renewal rights under U.S. copyright law. The defense presented a counterargument that proved decisive. Ring of Fire had not been written by Johnny Cash alone. It was co-written by June Carter Cash and country musician Merle Kilgore. Legally, the publishing belonged to June. When she died, her assets passed to her husband, and when Cash died, his interest transferred to John Carter. The daughters, regardless of their blood connection to the man most associated with the song, had no legal claim to something their father had never actually owned outright. A federal judge ruled definitively in 2009, not merely dismissing the case, but questioning whether the daughters had legal standing to bring it at all. John Carter Cash assumed full operational control of the estate in the years that followed, approving or declining every significant use of his father's name and image, film adaptations, advertising synchronizations, archival releases, and beyond. Roseanne Cash, the eldest of the daughters and herself an acclaimed artist, has been the most willing to discuss the emotional aftermath publicly, speaking about the difficulty of watching her father's image function as a managed commercial entity from which she is legally excluded, while also acknowledging that her relationship with her half-brother has not been entirely severed. The siblings have moved toward a kind of acceptance, not of the legal outcome as just, but of it as irreversible. Meanwhile, the commercial machinery has continued to expand. The 2005 biographical film Walk the Line introduced Cash's story to an entirely new generation, driving streams and album sales dramatically upward. Each anniversary reissue, each documentary, each licensing deal adds to an estate that does not depreciate. Music rights compound. What remains is a portrait of how success at a certain scale transforms the dynamics of a family. The man who walked into Sun Records with a guitar and a restless spirit could not have anticipated the legal architecture that would one day surround his name. His daughters carry his story in their memories and in their blood. His son carries it in the ledger. The rest of the world carries it in the music, which plays on as if the complications behind it never existed at all.